They lied about Antarctica. Ancient maps reveal what was actually hidden under the ice. The map that shouldn't exist. The archivist's hands trembled as he unrolled the parchment. Dust rose like ghostly smoke in the dim room inside Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, the year 1929 etched on the edge of the record book beside him. For a second, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Coastlines drawn with startling precision, a tangle of ink notes in Ottoman Turkish, strange animals scrolling across the margins. Then he saw it, a curved southern landmass no one expected to find there. It looked like Antarctica, but this map was dated 1513. The discovery should have been impossible. Official history insists Antarctica wasn't even sighted until 3 centuries later, yet here it was, drawn on aged gazelle parchment, its contours eerily familiar to anyone raised on a modern globe. Word spread quietly at first, rumors in the museum halls of a medieval chart that looked like it came from the future. But secrets don't stay buried long. Turkish map shows unknown continent, one headline teased. Scholars scoffed, historians blinked, and somewhere deep in a military archive, a new file was quietly labeled Piri Reis. The shock wasn't that it existed, it was what it seemed to know. When compared to modern maps, some saw astonishing alignment, the coast of South America matching down the curve, and below that a massive continent drawn as if seen free from ice. Modern satellites centuries later would confirm ridges, bays, and mountain slopes under Antarctica's frozen sheet, features strangely similar to what the parchment portrayed. People began to whisper, how did a 16th century Admiral map what human eyes hadn't seen in tens of thousands of years? This was no idle curiosity. The man behind it, Piri Reis, wasn't just some anonymous cartographer. He was an Ottoman admiral with access to half the world's navigators. In the margin of his map, he left notes claiming he'd compiled it from older charts, some drawn since the time of Alexander the Great. He even mentioned maps of the ancient kings of the seas. Nobody knew what that meant, but the implication was clear. He hadn't invented it, he was copying something older. And that opened the door to a far stranger idea, that fragments of knowledge from a civilization long gone had survived into recorded history, passed through traders and explorers until they landed in Piri Reis's hands. The kind of knowledge that shouldn't have existed in an age when most Europeans still argued about whether dragons lived past the horizon. As more experts peered at the parchment, the mystery deepened. The projection style wasn't typical of early 150s maps. It matched a much later, mathematically precise system called an equidistant projection, normally used by 20th century aviation for plotting distances from a single central point. Somehow, a sailor in 1513 had drawn using geometry that wouldn't be formally described for another 400 years. So you start asking, what else do we get wrong about history? If one forgotten document can rewrite everything we thought we knew about exploration, what other fragments are still buried in archives and ice cores, waiting to humiliate our textbooks? The Piri Reis map isn't just an artifact, it's a challenge burnt into parchment, daring us to question how far back real navigation, real mapping, and maybe even real civilization actually go. That's the riddle that surfaced in 1929, a riddle that made scientists argue, theologians sweat, and conspiracy theorists start printing flyers. A 16th century chart showing an uniced Antarctica. And if that description makes you pause, it should. Because the deeper you stare at it, the less sense it makes, and the more impossible it becomes to laugh off. To understand how that's possible, we have to crawl back, way back to where this map came from. The Admiral who mapped the impossible. Piri Reis was born into water. His uncles were corsairs in the Mediterranean, his childhood spent between salt air and the sound of rigging snapping in the wind. By the time he joined the Ottoman Navy, he already saw the ocean differently from everyone else. Every coastline had a memory, and those memories could be traced in ink if you listened carefully enough. To command the sea, you had to chart it first. He honed that obsession through shipyards and war campaigns, collecting navigational scraps wherever he could find them, Portuguese charts, Arabic scrolls, whispers from Genoese captains, even fragments looted from Spanish caravels. To Piri, maps were more valuable than gold. By the early 150s, the world was expanding faster than scholars could describe it. Columbus had crossed an ocean but still believed he'd reached Asia. Portuguese explorers were edging along the African coast toward India. And the Ottomans, ambitious and curious, wanted a piece of that new knowledge. Piri served under his uncle, the legendary Admiral Kemal Reis, who raided European fleets and gathered their navigational secrets. Each capture brought new scraps, partial maps, coordinates, coastal diagrams inked on parchment. Piri noted them meticulously. He wasn't content with ordinary cartography. While Europeans drew rough guesses flanked by sea monsters, Piri wanted mathematical precision. He wrote that each sailor, each ancient mariner left behind traces of knowledge like footprints on shifting sand. If he could gather enough of them, he might reconstruct the entire shoreline of the known world, and perhaps parts that were no longer known at all. His notes describe maps drawn according to the ancient kings of the seas, and his introduction to the 1513 world map mentions sources going back to the time of Alexander. Scholars read that and shrugged. But think about it, Alexander's time means the 4th century BC. What geographic data could possibly have survived that long? According to Piri, quite a lot. He claimed access to 8 maps of ancient origin and one from Columbus himself. That last detail would only be confirmed centuries later when modern researchers realized that part of his South American coastline matches the general outline of a map Columbus showed to the Spanish court, one that's now lost. So yes, Piri Reis somehow ended up with fragments tied to the earliest explorers of the Atlantic, but the others, no one knows. Those older charts could have been anything: Byzantine reconstructions, surviving Greek periploi, even rumored remnants from the Library of Alexandria's collection before the fires. To picture how radical that was, remember what navigation meant in 1513. Sailors traveled with little more than compasses, stars, and prayer. They measured speed by tossing logs into the water and counting the moments until the rope's knot slackened. The world beyond familiar ports was blank parchment labeled "Here be monsters." Yet the map Piri Reis drew in that same year shows precision so advanced it uses a projection method the U.S. Air Force would later employ for intercontinental targeting. He centered it not on Mecca or Rome, but roughly near Cairo, suggesting he understood how to project distances outward equally in all directions. Nobody else of his era used that geometry. What made him different wasn't sorcery, it was synthesis. He knitted together forgotten knowledge scattered across civilizations. Imagine him in his workshop in Gallipoli, parchment stretched over a wooden table, surrounding himself with fragments and sea-worn scrolls, trying to align coastlines that belonged to maps centuries apart. The world he envisioned wasn't flat or rimmed with dragons, it was a network of data. Every line on his chart represented generations of sailors who had risked their lives to describe the edges of continents they barely understood. In his margins, written in careful Ottoman Turkish, Piri left commentary as if addressing future readers. He explained which sections came from which sources where the data disagreed and which ancient map he trusted more. One note claims information from the maps drawn in the time of Alexander. Another attributes coastal accuracy to Indian and Portuguese pilots who understood the art of navigation. That mix of Muslim, Christian, and possibly pre-classical references wasn't typical of the Islamic cartography of his time. He was blending worlds, melding sacred geography with empirical observation. The Ottoman court encouraged him because mapping was power. Every accurately drawn port meant easier conquest and safer trade, but even his peers must have noticed there was something haunting about his compilation. He described lands no Ottoman had seen, animals nobody in Istanbul could name, coastlines sketched with a confidence bordering on arrogance. His map didn't guess, it declared. When he presented part of it to Sultan Selim I around 1517, accounts suggest the Sultan was impressed but puzzled. The empire's ambitions lay toward Egypt, not across the Atlantic. Piri's work earned praise yet faded quietly into the vast archives of the Topkapi Palace, rolled up and forgotten as new wars demanded the empire's attention. The Admiral would later write an even larger world atlas, the Kitab Letter 131 Barii, a detailed navigation guide for hundreds of ports. But the 1513 map remained his greatest enigma. That parchment would sleep under layers of dust for over 4 centuries. When the museum archivists stumbled upon it in 1929, Piri had been dead nearly 400 years, executed by order of another sultan after political rivals accused him of retreating during a naval campaign. He never saw his map's resurrection, never knew that modern scientists would argue over his legacy, or that his name would one day appear in Air Force reports. But in hindsight, everything about his life aligns with a pattern, a man positioned between ages. He lived when the medieval world still mirrored myth, yet he thought like a modern data compiler. He saw information as something to aggregate, test, and refine. And that's what made his 1513 chart terrifying for later historians. It shouldn't have been possible for a sailor from his century to depict coastlines that precise. So when experts in the 20th century finally unrolled that parchment and compared its contours with modern projections, they didn't just see artistry. They saw an unsolved equation between antiquity and modernity, between myth and mathematics. Piri Reis, the admiral who mapped the impossible, had conjured a world that still refuses to fit into linear history. Centuries later, when scholars and military analysts stared at the rediscovered document under fluorescent light, they realized something unsettling. We weren't just looking at a beautiful map. We were staring into a mirror held up by a man who'd lived half a millennium ago, one that reflected knowledge humanity wasn't supposed to possess. And that's when disbelief turned into fascination. Because the moment they recognized what those southern lines might represent, every assumption about human exploration began to crack. Centuries after he died, Piri Reis still whispered through ink and parchment, daring modern minds to ask the question he'd quietly tucked between 1513's coordinates, who told us what lay beneath the ice. The Rediscovery in 1929. Morning light slanted through the narrow windows of the Topkapi Palace Library. Dust drifted like slow snowfall through thin beams of gold, catching on the breath of a young archivist named Halil Edem Eldem. He was cataloging neglected bundles of parchment from the imperial treasury, centuries of forgotten charts stored in animal hide tubes, some so brittle they cracked when opened. On that winter morning in 1929, one tube resisted at first. When he pried it loose and unrolled the contents across a wide table, color slashed through the dust, coastlines painted in ochre and green, delicate compass roses, and sprawled across the lower edge, a continent that shouldn't have been there. He called for his supervisor. Within minutes, 2 scholars from the Museum of Antiquities crowded around, careful not to touch the ink. The script was Ottoman Turkish. The title read, "A Map of the New World drawn by Admiral Piri Reis, year 1513 of our Lord." Everyone in that room knew what that implied. A map of the New World, created less than 2 decades after Columbus had first crossed the ocean, was already valuable, but the lower portion. That curved landmass stretching far south of South America, it looked like another continent entirely. At first they thought it must be a misdrawn extension of South America. Then one scholar murmured it aloud, "Antarctica." The word lingered like forbidden magic. They laughed nervously. After all, the southern continent wasn't sighted until 182, yet the shapes on the parchment resembled Coastline's modern atlases placed beneath the South Pole's ice. The archivists compared it against contemporary charts and something uncanny emerged. The ratio of measurements, the angle of the southern tip, the setting of islands off the coast, all mirrored real geography no 16th century cartographer should have known. Copies were sent to the Ministry of Education, then to foreign embassies. Within months, scholars across Europe and America were whispering about the Ottoman map that shouldn't exist. Newspapers published grainy black and white reproductions. Archaeological discovery stuns historians. Blared an Istanbul headline. To the public, it was a curiosity, to academics, an irritation. How could an artifact so anachronistic appear just when cartography prided itself on precision born of science? In Berlin and London, experts debated the obvious explanations. Perhaps Piri Reis had exaggerated South America's coastline, drawing it too far south. Maybe his map suffered the same distortion as other portolan charts where curvature forced landmasses to merge. But there were details that refused to cooperate with skepticism. The mountains sketched beneath the southern latitude weren't speculative doodles. They matched ridge contours confirmed 4 centuries later by seismic studies. The rivers that seemed to flow inland paralleled subglacial channels no one suspected existed, until radar found them in the 20th century. The rediscovery sent ripples through historical circles. The Turkish government authorized careful conservation, later displaying the map in the Palace Museum. Western researchers clamored for photographs. Harvard's cartographic journal printed analyses. Each drew the same reluctant conclusion: this wasn't an accidental shape. Whoever drew those southern coasts had access to data from a remarkably advanced source. Meanwhile, others sniffed opportunity. Adventurers and pseudo-scholars seized on the story, writing pamphlets claiming proof of Atlantis. Ancient air navigators, one American magazine declared, insisting that the accuracy could only come from aerial surveys lost to time. A few scientists entertained more cautious theories. Perhaps remnants of Roman or Phoenician exploration had reached far south and left maps that survived in forgotten libraries, copied endlessly until Piri Reis compiled them. But even that stretched plausibility. No known civilization had charted beyond the Magellan Strait before the 150s. For museum staff, the growing frenzy was surreal. Visitors lingered before the display, whispering that governments would hide the truth. They pointed to the margin notes where Piri Reis referenced maps older than the flood. Some newspapers trimmed that line for space, others highlighted it as prophecy. Curiosity turned to myth almost overnight. Behind closed doors, academics faced a more prosaic dilemma. If the map was genuine, what did it say about the lineage of geographical knowledge? Each line implied an unbroken transmission of data through centuries of war, fire, and empire. But if the southern continent wasn't an ice-free Antarctica, then what was it? A distorted echo of Terra Australis, the legendary land early Europeans imagined balancing the northern hemisphere. That explanation satisfied rationalists, but failed to explain the uncanny matching contours to the Queen Maud Land region. By 1933, copies circulated among naval offices and university archives worldwide. Somewhere in Washington, an officer in a remote cartography unit took notice but filed it away under historic maps miscellaneous. For a while, the excitement faded. The Great Depression and upcoming war swallowed attention. The Piri Reis map became an academic footnote, referenced in obscure journals and vanishing back into quiet archives. But the seed had been planted. When the Cold War dawned decades later, the map resurfaced in an unexpected place. amidst military cartographers, radar analysts, and a new breed of scientists obsessed with precision. To them, the strange alignment between a 16th century drawing and modern seismic profiles wasn't just a historical fluke, it was a potential data mystery worth solving. The rediscovery in 1929 had been almost accidental, a half-hour curiosity during a dusty morning shift. Yet that chance moment sparked one of the most enduring controversies in cartographic history. It turned a forgotten Ottoman admiral into both hero and heretic, and it gave 20th century science a question it still hasn't completely answered. How did a man writing in the margins of a 1513 map know to draw land beyond the known world, and why did he seem to show it free of ice? The museum staff couldn't know it then, but those inked coastlines would soon travel far beyond the quiet palace hall. They would end up under fluorescent lights in a U.S. Air Force office 3 decades later, where men trained to map missile trajectories would stare at Piri Reis's outline and whisper the same word the archivists once had: Antarctica. And that's when a forgotten artifact stopped being a historian's puzzle and started becoming classified intelligence. Because what began in 1929 as a museum curiosity was about to step into the Cold War's secret world of reconnaissance. What seemed like a relic was now evidence, and the question it carried would turn from who drew this to how much did they know and when. The Air Force investigation. By 196, the map had migrated from museum archives to military curiosity. The world was split between two nuclear giants, and both were obsessed with accuracy: ballistic tables, missile arcs, the geometry of global reach. Anything that hinted at advanced mapping intrigued the Strategic Air Command, the U.S. Air Force's precision nucleus of global deterrence. Into that environment stepped Captain Arlington Mallory, an amateur historian with an engineer's fixation on strange cartographic coincidences, and Professor Charles Hapgood, a New Hampshire academic fascinated by lost knowledge. Mallory had first examined photographs of the Piri Reis Map through naval contacts, convinced it wasn't a hoax. He brought his findings to Hapgood, who shared them with his students in a seminar titled Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. Together they argued the Ottoman admiral's coastlines fit too well with modern seismic data to be coincidence. But to test the claim, they needed experts fluent in projection geometry, cartographers trained to read globes as weapon trajectories. That's how the matter landed on the desks of the Strategic Air Command's 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron. At Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts, LT Colonel Harold Z. Olmeyer read the correspondence with skepticism. Yet the copy of the map on his desk drew him in. Those southern lines looked disturbingly familiar to anyone who'd studied polar charts. The Air Force crew reconstructed the map's projection, discovering it used an equidistant layout centered near Cairo, the same mathematical method SAC employed for missile range estimation. That alone demanded attention. 16th century mapmakers didn't use equidistant projections. Weeks later, Olmeyer dictated an official letter to Hapgood dated July 6, 196. Behind the cautious tone, his words landed like a classified revelation. He wrote that the lower portion of the Piri Reis Map reasonably portrays the Princess Martha coast of Queen Maud Land, Antarctica, and the Palmer Peninsula. For a military analyst trained to separate fact from fantasy, that was already impossible enough. But the next line sealed it. The geographic detail matched, very remarkably, with the results of the seismic profile made across the top of the ice cap by the Swedish-British-Norwegian expedition of 1949. The Air Force had effectively confirmed what shouldn't exist, that a 16th century chart mirrored terrain known only to 20th century instruments. Internally, that letter read less like curiosity and more like quiet validation of the unthinkable. Hapgood students nearly rioted from excitement. The Air Force's acknowledgement seemed like official validation. A follow-up report a year later went further. The southern coast of the Piri Reis Map appears to be truly represented, and the original source maps must have been made before the present Antarctic ice cap covered the Queen Maud Land coasts. That single paragraph launched decades of speculation. Newspapers condensed it into sensational language. Air Force finds proof of pre-Ice Age map, though the report never said proof. It simply failed to offer another explanation. Understanding why the Air Force looked at an Ottoman map in the first place requires context. During the Cold War, cartography wasn't just geography, it was strategy. The military's analysts designed targeting charts predicting flight times from NATO bases to Soviet silos, all using polar projections identical to those visible on the Piri Reis parchment. When specialists noticed that the ancient geometry mirrored their own internal methods, curiosity became professional pride. If an old sailor centuries ago had intuitively used their projection, what else might he have known? Inside the conference rooms at Westover, the discussions alternated between technical analysis and uneasy humor. Some officers half-joked that maybe the ancients had aircraft too, others insisted the alignment was cherry-picking at best. Still, They couldn't explain the pattern recognition forming between ancient ink and modern data. Every time they overlaid the reconstructed map onto current Antarctic charts, sections of coastline along Queen Maud Land fell near perfectly into place, until the curvature broke near the Palmer Peninsula. That near alignment teased them like a ghost signal halfway lost in noise. Meanwhile, Hapgood refined his theory further. He argued that if the map was copied from older charts predating the last ice age, then humanity's cartographic lineage was vastly older than recorded history. He proposed an audacious mechanism, pole shift. According to his book Earth-Shifting Crust, the entire outer layer of the planet could slip periodically, relocating the poles and freezing once temperate lands in sudden ice. Thus, what the Piri Reis source maps showed wasn't imagination. It was Antarctica before a catastrophic tilt. The Air Force analysts didn't endorse that idea, but they didn't totally dismiss it either. Their brief was technical, not geological. They simply noted an extraordinary correspondence between the ancient depiction and the post-seismic data. Within internal circles, though, doubts grew. Glaciologists pointed out that removing Antarctica's current ice cap would trigger massive isostatic rebound, altering coastlines beyond recognition. Still, those objections stayed mostly within science journals. For the media and for everyone fascinated by forbidden archaeology, the Air Force letter was enough. By 1963, Hapgood's theories had spread through late-night radio, UFO conventions, and university halls. The Piri Reis Map became a touchstone for anyone convinced history hid a forgotten civilization. Hapgood even sent a copy of his findings to Albert Einstein, who replied politely that the concept of crustal displacement was interesting and not impossible. That cautious compliment became immortalized as endorsement, further fueling belief that the Piri Reis Map was the real deal, evidence of a pre-Ice Age world surveyed by an advanced global culture. Within the Air Force, though, interest faded almost as quickly as it rose. Ohlmeyer's team concluded their cartographic review, satisfied that whatever correlation existed didn't imply conspiracy, just coincidence filtered through projection distortion. Yet the documents circulated widely enough to birth legend. Hapgood cited them as verification, critics called them misinterpretation. Neither side realized the letters themselves would outlive both the analysts and the author, reappearing online decades later as the canonical proof of what the government knew. What's striking isn't that the Air Force got involved, it's why they cared at all. The 196s were the age of reconnaissance and aerial mapping. The very technology that revealed the true topography under Antarctica's ice, the seismic instruments, polar flights, and orbital imagery, was born from the same military apparatus analyzing the map. In a sense, one form of global vision was judging another. The parallels were too tempting for storytellers to resist. A modern empire with satellites dissecting a dead admiral's parchment, both claiming to see the invisible continent below. Rumors grew that copies of other ancient charts were also under review. The Orion's Fine World Map of 1531, the Buech Map, later the enigmatic Orontius Phineus projection, each supposedly hinted at subglacial coastlines. Hapgood compiled them into a sweeping thesis. Ancient cartographers possessed precise global knowledge later lost in the chaos following Ice Age floods. Critics countered that he simply misread distorted projections as accuracy. Still, his narrative had one unbreakable hook. The U.S. Air Force had found remarkable agreement. Whether or not they believed it, they'd written it down. And in the Cold War's climate of secrecy, any hint of classified endorsement made the myth bulletproof. If the military said nothing more, it could always be claimed they were hiding confirmation. Hapgood leaned into that vacuum, framing the silence as mystery. For the public, that silence was as persuasive as proof. Within a few years, the controversy had become part of pop culture. Documentary hosts spoke of ancient mapmakers in contact with lost civilizations. The Piri Reis Map was reprinted in magazines beside headlines asking if Antarctica had once been Atlantis. Few mentioned that official geologists had already debunked isostatic assumptions, showing how melting the ice would transform coastlines beyond any recognizably accurate outline. But myths travel faster than corrections, and the Air Force letter gave myth its wings. So when people today look back at the saga and ask whether the U.S. military really confirmed an ice-free Antarctica, the answer depends on which layer of reality they prefer. Officially, the reconnaissance officers never claimed ancient technology, only cartographic coincidence. But unofficially, their analysis provided exactly what legends need, authority tinted with mystery. And that's how a 16th century parchment became entangled with 20th century geopolitics. A map born in Ottoman ink ended up under Cold War fluorescent lights. The admirals were gone, the empires had changed, yet the puzzle remained identical. Did someone somewhere in our deep past know the shape of Antarctica before it froze? Hapgood believed yes, the Air Force ultimately said no. But their brief conversation across centuries ensured one thing: the mystery would never be fully buried again. Lost civilizations or lost in translation. By the time Hapgood's ideas hit print, the story had outgrown the map itself. Newspapers boiled his theory down to a sensational riddle. Either an unknown civilization charted Antarctica before the Ice Age, or every modern scientist had missed one of history's biggest coincidences. There wasn't much appetite for coincidence. Across lecture halls and late-night talk shows, audiences leaned toward the extraordinary. If an ice-free Antarctica had once existed, then someone must have seen it. And if they saw it, who were they? Hapgood's answer was as bold as his mathematics. He believed an advanced seafaring culture existed tens of thousands of years ago, an old world destroyed by catastrophic pole shifts. In Earth's shifting crust, he proposed that the planet's outer layer could slip over its molten interior like loose skin. Whole continents would relocate within months, shoving former tropics toward polar latitudes and burying cities beneath glaciers. Antarctica, he said, was once closer to the equator, home to humans who mastered navigation long before recorded time. The Piri Reis Map, in that logic, wasn't an anachronism. It was a fossilized photograph of that forgotten age, copied and recopied through millennia until it landed on Ottoman parchment. The theory electrified dreamers. Suddenly Plato's Atlantis looked less mythic and more geographical. Hapgood argued that when ancient stories spoke of a sudden flood or the falling of the sky, they were misremembering the crust slip, a global disaster wiping nearly everything clean except a few survivors clutching their charts of the old world. Those survivors, he suggested, sailed to Egypt, to the Andes, to Mesopotamia, teaching architecture, astronomy, and the mathematics of navigation to younger cultures that later took credit for civilization itself. Cue the montage of coincidences. The Great Pyramid aligned to true north within a fraction of a degree, Incan stone blocks carved with machine-like precision, seafaring myths from Polynesia to the Mediterranean speaking of lost homelands drowned by ice or flood. Hapgood wove them into a single narrative. He saw Piri rise not as an isolated marvel but as a missing link, evidence that ancient science never truly died. Critics, though, were ruthless. Geophysicists pointed out that continental drift and isostatic rebound make Hapgood's quick-shift mechanism impossible. Giant tectonic plates don't just skid like loose shells. The energy required would melt the crust itself. Paleoclimatologists added that Antarctic ice cores stretch back hundreds of thousands of years, far older than any hypothesized civilization. You could move the poles on paper, but not in physics. Cartographers joined in. They demonstrated how the map's seeming accuracy came from projection distortion. The Antarctic coastline matched Queen Maud Land only after heavy stretching and selective alignment. Rotate South America slightly, they said, and you get the same fit. What Hapgood called precision was, to them, visual coincidence amplified by wishful mathematics. Even the U.S. Air Force analysts eventually acknowledged that the resemblance disappeared under rigorous coordinate analysis. Still, rebuttals couldn't kill the idea. For every diagram proving distortion, believers produced another enigma. Why did multiple 16th-century maps show a mysterious landmass beneath South America in roughly the same position? Why did separate mapmakers, Orance Fine, Buech, Orontius Phineus, draw similar southern continents with inner rivers and mountains later found under Antarctic ice? If they were all guessing, it was an awfully coordinated guess. Hapgood wasn't alone in his obsession. Around the same time, Jacques Bergier and Louis Pauwels, authors of The Morning of the Magicians, popularized the notion of a prehistoric master race wielding forgotten science. To them, the Piri Reis Map was less a document than a revelation, that humanity's memory stretched further back than archaeology allowed. Cold War audiences living under looming annihilation found strange comfort in that. If a civilization once rose and fell before ours, maybe humanity could begin again after another cataclysm. Ancient apocalypse doubled as modern reassurance. For professional historians, that cultural hunger explained more than the map did. They argued that people didn't want data, they wanted meaning. The idea of a lost advanced civilization reframed time itself. It promised that progress wasn't linear but cyclical, that somewhere beneath our foundations lay proof of earlier genius. Archaeology, with its sober timelines of chipped stone tools, suddenly felt inadequate beside tales of vanished astronomers and global cataclysms. Meanwhile, linguists picked through Piri's own notes. He never claimed to know the age of his sources, only that some were from the time of Alexander and others older than the flood. In Ottoman idiom, the flood meant antiquity, not necessarily an ice age. Translation inflated metaphor into evidence. What might have been poetic shorthand became, in English editions, literal pre-Diluvian testimony. Every lyrical flourish became a breadcrumb for believers. And misinterpretation bred feedback loops. One popular 196's magazine article quoted Piri as saying he'd used charts of ancient kings, which readers recast as proof of extraterrestrial contact, the kings reimagined as ancient astronauts. Soon the map appeared in UFO documentaries, its coastline glowing under dramatic narration. Lost civilization theories merged with alien influence. Perhaps the same visitors who taught Egyptians to build pyramids had mapped the planet from orbit. The Piri Reis parchment morphed from artifact into talisman, proof that someone, human or not, knew the world's design long before we rediscovered it. But inside universities, a quieter realization emerged. Even if every mystical claim evaporated, the map still demonstrated something profound. Knowledge survives chaos. Real fragments of Greek, Arab, and possibly older cartographic data had traveled through centuries of war, translation, and religious upheaval to resurface in the Ottoman court. Civilization in that sense was continuous. The legend of a golden age might simply be the memory of cultural relay. The baton of discovery passed from one empire to the next. So maybe there was a lost civilization, but not of superhumans, just of forgotten scholars whose libraries burned. Maybe the ancient mapmakers were Egyptian surveyors, Phoenician merchants, or Hellenistic geographers whose work vanished during Rome's decline. Their data might have drifted through Byzantium, through Arab astronomers, until it reached Piri Reis's table. If so, the wonder isn't that Antarctica was mapped early. It's that knowledge itself proved so resilient it could cross 2,000 years disguised as myth. Still, Hapgood's charisma kept the grander version alive. He lectured with near-evangelical energy, showing students overlays of the map against modern polar charts. Each coincidence drew gasps. To doubters, he said, "Science demands curiosity," a statement vague enough to be irrefutable. He died in 1982 without definitive proof, yet the community he inspired flourished online decades later, transforming his cautious speculation into gospel. Across forums and documentaries, the Piri Reis Map remained Exhibit A in the case for lost enlightenment. And maybe that endurance says something about us more than about any vanished age. Scientific rebuttals satisfy the mind, but mystery feeds the imagination. We can accept geological evidence that Antarctica's been frozen for millions of years and still wonder whose eyes first charted its shadowed coast. The legend survives because it scratches both itches, the thrill of contradiction and the hope of legacy. While academics dismissed Hapgood's pole shifts as fantasy, the cultural aftershock of his ideas lingered. Every time new satellite imagery exposed hidden mountains or subglacial lakes, headlines echoed his premise. The ice concealed a story, and though geology had the final word, myth kept the microphone. Every debate circled back to one question none could settle: whether those southern lines on Piri Reis's parchment captured memory or imagination. Maybe both. Maybe a sailor shaping continents from rumor accidentally linked his century to an age beyond remembering. Between ink and ice sits that unsolvable middle ground where faith, data, and longing all overlap. Meanwhile, new science beneath Antarctica was telling its own story. And what researchers were finding under the ice threatened to make the legend, if not true, then at least newly mysterious. Because while the map's accuracy stayed contested, the continent itself was proving far less static than anyone ever believed. What lies under the ice? By the 21st century, debates about the Piri Reis map had moved from dusty archives to digital screens. But while arguments raged online, Antarctica itself was quietly revealing a deeper mystery, one bound not to parchment but to ice. Radar satellites were stripping away the continent's white mask, exposing mountains, river valleys, and hidden lakes beneath nearly 3 kilometers of frozen crust. And the more researchers saw, the stranger the comparisons became. Here was proof that the frozen world wasn't a static block at all, but a shifting, living landscape. A geography eerily reminiscent of the coastlines Piri Reis once drew in ink. Everything started with a ripple in satellite data. In the early 200s, scientists noticed subtle rises and dips in the surface of East Antarctica, as if the ice were breathing. Decades of radar observation confirmed what seemed impossible. Lakes of liquid water existed deep below, melted not by sunlight but by geothermal heat trapped under the weight of the ice sheet. These were the subglacial lakes, entire inland seas sealed in darkness for thousands, maybe millions of years. A handful were known in the 199s. Then came the satellite revolution. By the mid-202s, European Space Agency instruments had catalogued 231 active subglacial lakes, 85 of them newly discovered. That revelation rewrote what scientists thought they knew about the frozen continent. The lakes were not isolated pockets, but part of vast underground networks, arteries shifting water and sediment across hundreds of kilometers. Some drained suddenly, causing the surface above to drop by meters before refilling again months later. Others formed chains connected by meltwater channels that pulsed beneath the glaciers, lubricating their flow toward the sea. The result, a continent in perpetual slow motion, its hidden plumbing reshaping the ice from below. And while the discovery confirmed nothing mystical, it did echo one haunting aspect of the map. On Piri Reis's parchment, the supposed Antarctic coastline wasn't smooth. It featured bays, unfrozen rivers, inland ridges. For centuries, skeptics dismissed that as artistic filler. But now radar profiles were outlining buried valleys and ancient waterways beneath the ice sheet, terrain that might long ago have been open to the sea. It didn't prove the map's accuracy. Yet it raised the unsettling idea that the geography it hinted at genuinely exists beneath the ice today, invisible but real. Consider Lake Vostok, the largest of these buried seas, nearly 250 kilometers long, sealed under 4 kilometers of ice. When Russian drills finally reached its surface water in the early 200s, sensors detected oxygen levels rivaling Earth's oceans. The possibility of microbes surviving in such isolation thrilled biologists and astrobiologists alike. If life could endure under that pressure and darkness, maybe it could survive beneath the icy crusts of moons like Europa and Enceladus. Antarctica, once imagined as a dead wasteland, became a proxy for alien oceans. Then came an even larger revelation in 2025. Using a decade of Cryosat-2 radar data, scientists mapped an unprecedented expansion of known lake networks, particularly under drowning Maudland, the exact region Hapgood and Olmeyer had once claimed matched the Piri Reis coast. The coincidence was almost cinematic. Headlines screamed hidden rivers beneath Antarctica, while online theorists resurrected the 196's debate. Was science finally catching up to the map's impossible foresight? The truth was subtler but no less astonishing. Beneath the ice lay the Gamburtsev Mountains, a range the size of the Alps, completely buried and invisible to the naked eye. Seismic soundings showed peaks, valleys, and even possible fault lines vanishing under kilometers of ice. Their discovery in the late 20th century proved that Antarctica's foundation wasn't a flat desert but an ancient, eroded continent, one that before glaciation had rivers and plains not unlike any other. That revelation shifted the question from could it ever have been ice-free to when. Geological drilling revealed sediments from warm, forested epochs 35 million years old. Fossilized pollen hinted at temperate flora once covering the land. While that timeline predates humanity by tens of millions of years, it still underscored a key point. Antarctica had not always been a frozen void. It carried memories of water, vegetation, perhaps entire ecosystems swallowed by glacial onset. The continent in Piri Reis's imagination might have existed after all, not in human prehistory, but in Earth's own deeper past. Yet what truly unsettled researchers wasn't age but activity. The subglacial world turned out to be dynamic today. Water traveled between lakes through pressurized tunnels, sometimes draining immense volumes in days. When these bursts reached the coast, they could accelerate ice streams sliding toward the ocean, subtly altering sea level rise. The Antarctic plumbing system, hidden for eons, was influencing global climate patterns right now. Under that lens, the idea of a dormant continent waiting beneath the ice no longer sounded purely mythical. It was alive, shifting, and capable of changing the planet's future as surely as its past. For storytellers, this modern science blurs into legend. The mountains and valleys below the ice mirror the map's strange contours, hints of peninsulas, semicircular inlets, river deltas. Every new radar survey becomes a Rorschach test where believers see validation and scientists see complexity. Perhaps Piri Reis's ancient sources, whatever they were, recorded older coastlines distorted by projection. Or maybe his imagination accidentally traced the hidden truth, a truth no human could witness again until satellites pierced the ice half a millennium later. What no one disputes is the power of perception. The Piri Reis Map invited humanity to imagine an unmapped world. 21st century technology is finally delivering it. Each gigabyte of radar data, each seismic echo, adds to the portrait of a continent still withholding secrets. And with every revelation, the myth resurfaces. Maybe our ancestors knew more, saw more, explored more than we think. Meanwhile, geopolitics tilts southward. As nations race to build bases and claim research zones, sensors probing the ice serve dual purposes. Science above ground, strategy below. When satellites scan those hidden mountain ranges and lakes, they don't just map terrain, they chart potential resources, potential power. The world's last untouched frontier is becoming a mirror both for our curiosity and our greed. And that convergence makes the legend of the Piri Reis Map feel strangely prophetic. So here we are half a millennium after an Ottoman admiral inked coastlines he could not have seen, staring down images of the same buried geography through orbiting eyes. The ice is thinning, the politics thickening, and the line between myth and data keeps shifting. Modern scientists may not believe in lost civilizations, but the landscape beneath the ice still whispers like one, rivers that no longer flow, valleys resting under black water, mountains rumbling in subglacial dark. As revelations mount, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Antarctica isn't frozen history, it's frozen possibility. Every time a radar curl outlines a forgotten ridge, we edge closer to seeing what the world has hidden for tens of millions of years. And while that doesn't confirm any ancient map's prophecy, it does prove something equally haunting, that the planet itself still keeps secrets older, stranger, and far less static than we ever allowed ourselves to believe. Geopolitics of the frozen frontier. While the maps of the past stirred dreams of lost civilizations, the maps of the present are driving something far more tangible: power. For centuries, Antarctica existed as a blank space, a white void at the bottom of every globe, too cold and remote to tempt conquest. But that isolation is thinning along with the ice. Now the same continent that ignited myths of ancient knowledge has become a real battleground for modern ambition. It began as a pact of peace. In 1961, world powers signed the Antarctic Treaty, pledging to reserve the entire continent for science and cooperation. No armies, no mines, no borders, only research. For decades it worked because the environment itself enforced obedience. The cost of survival outweighed the value of anything hidden beneath the snow. But treaties age and technology doesn't rest. What satellites and icebreakers can reach, history shows nations will eventually claim. In the early 21st century, that quiet agreement started to buckle. Climate change was rewriting the rules faster than diplomats could renew them. Thinning ice opened sea routes once impossible. Drones mapped mineral signatures below the glaciers. Energy models hinted at oil, gas, and metal deposits locked under permafrost, resources every industrial civilization on Earth was beginning to covet. Almost overnight, the world's last untouched frontier looked less like a preserve for penguins, and more like the final unclaimed asset on the planet. China saw it first. In less than 2 decades, Beijing expanded from a single coastal outpost to 5 Antarctic bases, each described as scientific, yet some bristled with satellite dishes and long-range communication gear that conveniently doubled as military surveillance. Engineers framed it as dual-use civilian research with strategic benefit. But the message was clear: whoever commands the ice commands the data, and in the 21st century, data is the new territory. Russia followed suit, upgrading aging research stations into logistical hubs. Its vessel academic Alexander Karpinsky began extensive seismic mapping of the continental shelf, an act Western analysts quietly labeled resource surveying. When U.S. officials accused the expedition of prospecting for hydrocarbons in violation of treaty bans, Moscow simply called it oceanography. The result? A silent standoff disguised as science. Meanwhile, the United States maintained the largest continuous presence, flying regular missions to the South Pole and McMurdo Station. Publicly, those flights supplied research teams studying climate patterns. Privately, they provided aerial reconnaissance images of every new base sprouting across the ice. Washington's position remained officially moral, defending the treaty, defending peace, but beneath that posture lay a familiar motivation. If rivals weaponize information or access, the U.S. mustn't arrive late. The same paranoia that once fueled the space race now chills the polar wind. The first real flashpoint came not from armies but from krill. The tiny crustacean, pink, translucent, and abundant, is the foundation of Antarctica's food chain. It's also a billion-dollar industry for dietary supplements and aquaculture feed. In 2024, at a marine conservation meeting in Tasmania, China and Russia jointly blocked proposals to expand protected zones and limit krill harvest. Diplomats described it as a minor disagreement. Ecologists called it a warning shot. 2 superpowers had just coordinated to carve economic advantage into an ecosystem older than humanity itself. Behind every scientific facade lies strategy. Each new research outpost reinforces future territorial claims should the treaty collapse. Under article reviews scheduled for 2048, member nations can reconsider the ban on mineral exploitation. That date looms like a geological clock ticking beneath the snow. 48 years may sound distant, but in geopolitical time, that's tomorrow. Every runway paved today, every satellite uplink built under meteorological study, is a placeholder for tomorrow's ownership. Satellite imagery already reveals subtle expansion. Longer airstrips, hardened storage units, entire convoys moving supplies inland far beyond declared zones. Intelligence analysts interpret those footprints as positioning. After all, Antarctica's resource estimates read like a corporate dream: tens of billions of barrels of oil and gas equivalents, massive coal seams, rare earth metals critical for electronics, even freshwater reserves dwarfing the Amazon's flow. As warm season sea ice recedes, mining becomes less impossible each year. The last safeguard isn't diplomacy, it's logistics and cost. But the ice is melting faster than laws can freeze. In February 2025, Antarctic sea ice extent hit one of the lowest levels ever recorded, 187 million square kilometers, 8% below normal. Satellite sensors captured unprecedented surface melt events, nearly 4% of the entire ice sheet glistening with liquid water on a single day. To climate scientists, these numbers screamed emergency. To strategists, they whispered opportunity. Lower sea ice means easier access for ships. Easier access means feasible extraction. Every degree of warming redraws invisible borders. The old dream of Antarctica as a sanctuary is faltering under pressure from profit. Even the language used by policymakers betrays the shift. Where reports once spoke of research capacity, they now mention resource potential and strategic presence. When asked, officials insist the missions are peaceful. Yet militarization rarely begins with soldiers, it begins with infrastructure. Build habitats capable of supporting civilians year-round, and you suddenly have the groundwork for any occupation you like. Western observers call it the salami-slicing approach, tiny, legalistic steps that accumulate until the original treaty is irrelevant. Construct a new satellite ground station here, extend a runway there, deploy additional meteorological drones over disputed waters. Each slice seems innocuous, together they create control. And because every signatory technically adheres to the letter of cooperation, there's no violation to prosecute. Enforcement depends on consensus, and consensus depends on self-restraint, a fragile condition in an age of energy scarcity. Environmentalists warn that the ice itself may become collateral damage long before open conflict. Already krill populations are shrinking from simultaneous fishing and climatic strain. Penguins and whales face food shortages that ripple through entire ecosystems. The same nations pledging scientific stewardship risk turning the continent into another industrial frontier. Some researchers privately admit the irony stings. Humanity's first genuine cooperative experiment is degenerating into a resource rush visible from orbit. For historians of the Piri Reis legend, the parallel is darkly poetic. Centuries ago, a map drawn in curiosity hinted that Antarctica once carried open coasts and temperate waters. Today, geopolitics might achieve that condition again, not through ancient warmth but through modern heat. What ancient nature froze, human ambition may thaw. And here's where the story loops back on itself. As satellites probe beneath the ice, governments interpret the data not as revelation but as inventory. The same drive that made Piri Reis stitch together forgotten charts now drives nations to compile the continent acre by acre, scan by scan. The motive hasn't changed: knowledge as leverage, exploration as prelude to power. So when you hear diplomats calling Antarctica the common heritage of mankind, understand what that really means: common until someone finds profit. The frozen frontier is no longer a dreamscape at the edge of maps, it's the next chapter of global competition. China and Russia planting their flags, the United States guarding its stations, Europe insisting on environmental virtue while eyeing mineral contracts, all circling a continent of silence the size of the United States and Mexico combined. The irony is almost cosmic. While public debates fixate on whether an Ottoman admiral glimpsed the uniced coast 5 centuries ago, modern powers are preparing to unice it for real. The legend of the Piri Reis Map once symbolized impossible knowledge, now it shadows a very possible greed, and the timing feels too precise to ignore. Just as science confirms new valleys and subglacial lakes, politicians see new resources and new borders. Strange timing indeed, considering a centuries-old map once hinted this land was far from lifeless. The science versus speculation showdown. For every spectacular claim ever thrown at the Piri Reis Map, scientists have built an equally sharp counterargument. This is where the legend hits the wall of geology, a battle fought not with conspiracy boards but with data. And depending on which side you're on, it either ends the story or makes it even more mysterious. Start with the ice itself. Modern glaciology insists Antarctica has been locked in its frozen state for at least 34 million years. Even during the warmest interglacial periods, coastal ice never vanished entirely. That alone wipes out the idea of a human civilization mapping its shores 10 or 12,000 years ago. To erase the ice sheet, you'd need global temperatures tens of degrees higher, conditions the fossil record shows haven't existed since the age of early primates. So by the numbers, a pre-ice age civilization drawing modern Antarctica is geologically impossible. Then there's the issue of isostatic rebound, the slow rise of land once heavy glaciers melt away. When 2 kilometers of ice press down on rock, gravity and mantle flow flat everything beneath. Remove that weight and the crust flexes upward, in some regions nearly a kilometer. Coastlines shift dramatically, bays become mountainsides, valleys turn into seabed. That means the shape of ice-free Antarctica would look nothing like its current bedrock outline. So even if someone had somehow charted it without ice, their map wouldn't match what satellites see today. Hapgood's assumption that subglacial topography reflects bare Earth conditions simply didn't survive physics. Critics also point out how projection distortion created illusions of accuracy. The Piri Reis Map compresses longitudinal distances near the poles. When you stretch it back over a modern grid, South America bends southward, its tail curling almost into the Antarctic Circle. The supposed Antarctic coastline overlays perfectly on South America's distorted edge, not the real southern continent. What believers celebrate as precision might be nothing more than artistic geometry multiplied by error. Still, the coincidences gnaw at people. The alignment along Queen Maud Land looks too convincing for mere fluke. Even some cartographers admit the curvature halfway resembles reality until you realize that humans are wired to find patterns in chaos. It's the same illusion hunters experience tracing animals in clouds or shapes on Mars. To believers, dismissal sounds like arrogance. To scientists, belief looks like optical bias. The showdown reached its peak when geologists confronted Hapgood students in public debates through the 197s. They brought seismic slices of Antarctica, proving that Ohlmeyer's famous Air Force comparison was misleading. The 1949 Swedish-British-Norwegian expedition hadn't mapped the actual coastline at all. It had measured internal ice layers. Hapgood had mistaken subglacial contour lines for coastal edges. In simple terms, he'd matched apples to avalanches. The audience nodded politely, yet half walked out still convinced something profound had been hidden. Facts could dent the myth but never sink it. And that might be because the myth satisfies desires data can't. Science explains how, but mystery explains why. People crave forbidden knowledge partly because discovery feels personal. It turns you into the hero solving what authorities ignored. The Piri Reis debate became a mirror for that impulse. To skeptics, it proved human ingenuity, an Ottoman admiral combining known charts into an impressive but normal composite. To believers, it proved conspiracy, that mainstream institutions fear rewriting history. Two sides, same coin, both driven by awe. Yet even scientists admit a few unsolved details remain. The equidistant projection Piri Reis used wasn't common until modern times. How he intuitively centered it near Cairo suggests mathematical sophistication rare for the early 150s. The Ottomans inherited formidable astronomy from earlier Islamic scholars, but computing such projection by hand required an understanding of spherical trigonometry few sailors possessed. For some, that lingering math puzzle keeps the door cracked open. Maybe he copied it from older maps using similar geometry, ones now lost. That idea doesn't need aliens or vanished empires, it just requires history to have bigger gaps than we like to admit. There's also the uncanny problem of South America. Even dismissing Antarctica entirely, the Western Hemisphere portion of the Piri Reis Map captures its shape with near-modern accuracy. The Amazon mouth, the taper toward Patagonia, details unmatched by any European chart of the era. Columbus himself never sailed that far south. Portuguese expeditions only vaguely charted Brazil. So where did Piri Reis get the data? His notes mention 16 source maps, including one of the western lands drawn by Columbus and several of ancient origin. It's reasonable to think he used early Spanish and Portuguese coastal surveys now lost to time. Still, no surviving document shows that level of precision. In that sense, part of the mystery remains factual rather than fantastical. Data vanished, leaving puzzle pieces but not the picture. After decades of arguing, what's left are two stories coexisting uncomfortably. Story 1. A brilliant Ottoman admiral assembled the best contemporary information, drawing coastlines so fine they coincidentally mimic hidden features of the southern pole. Story 2. Fragments from a civilization far older encoded real knowledge of an un-iced Antarctic world. Both persist because neither can fully erase the other. Every new satellite image reaffirming how little we actually know about the subglacial terrain refreshes the debate. Maybe Piri Reis guessed right. Maybe his sources carried echoes of ancient seafarers mapping coasts before the last meltwater pulse flooded them. Or maybe coincidence just wears a convincing mask. In the end, it's not science versus imagination, it's perspective versus need. Science argues the map fits within known history, speculation insists history itself isn't fully known. The conversation loops endlessly because each feeds the other. Skeptics tighten their equations, believers widen their metaphors, and somewhere between them the parchment keeps existing, obstinately real, daring everyone to interpret it. That endurance might be the most telling data point of all. For 5 centuries, one piece of gazelle skin has made humans argue about what we know of our own planet. If that isn't a sign of advanced intelligence, ours, not some lost race, what is? Because at its core, the showdown proves something both camps agree on. Curiosity survives every correction. The ink still calls, the ice still hides, and the line between map and mystery never fully melts. Traces of pre-ice age humans. For decades, skeptics insisted the Piri Reis Map's supposed foresight was coincidence. Then quietly, archaeology began finding footprints in the sand, literal ones. At first scattered, then multiplying, they revealed that humans had reached the far corners of the world earlier than anyone dared to admit. If civilizations rise and vanish like tides, maybe the shoreline of history scraped lower than textbooks imagine. Maybe fragments of those vanished tides survived, in ink, in rumor, in a 16th century admiral's notebook. Across deserts and frozen coasts, new dating methods were rewriting timelines. Genetic sequencing placed the divergence between Asian and early Native American populations at roughly 36,000 years ago, much earlier than theories built on the so-called Clovis first model. Those first settlers, guided by instinct and hunger, crossed continents when much of the northern hemisphere was still smothered in glaciers. Their route wasn't a single migration highway but a labyrinth of paths, some inland through the Bering Land Bridge, others along narrow coastal shelves that existed only when sea levels dropped hundreds of feet. That's where the story bends toward Antarctica, not because people walked to the pole, but because the pattern proves something deeper: humanity's persistence in exploring margins once considered closed. Today's archaeologists picture those early travelers hugging the edges of continents, moving with the rhythm of tides and ice. Between 23,000 and 14,000 years ago, during windows of relative warmth, those coasts opened like invitations. Frozen corridors thawed just enough for canoes carved from driftwood to slip through. The Pacific route, once dismissed as fantasy, is now backed by sites where blades and footprints mingle, evidence of humans living along the cold surf, while mammoths roamed inland. In ancient DNA, we find traces of maritime intelligence long before recorded navigation. Genetic clusters spreading down the Americas suggest people moved faster by sea than by step. They didn't need compasses, only memory and starlight. Picture them weaving through kelp forests along an ice-lined shore, mapping currents in their minds, naming each safe harbor. It's not the gleaming science of an advanced empire, but its navigation and its knowledge. Every campfire on that ancient coast was a coordinate, every story a waypoint. That same instinct to record distance, to hold geography inside language, could be the embryonic form of mapping itself. Then the seas rose. Between 10 and 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended, coastlines drowned beneath meltwater surges. Valleys turned to bays, villages to reefs. Archaeologists call that vanished fringe the continental shelf civilizations, societies erased when the oceans resumed their natural boundaries. Most of their artifacts, if they existed, now rest under layers of silt and salt. The few exceptions, polished stones, shards of Ashur-painted tools, wash up miles offshore, impossible to date precisely yet impossible to ignore. Modern sonar sweeps hint at the scale of that erasure. Off the coast of India's Gulf of Combat, divers trace submerged river channels lined with human-made debris. In Japan's Yonaguni Monument, divers debate whether step terraces are natural formations or remnants of prehistoric construction. Each discovery invites the same thought: what else vanished when ice melted? We assume prehistory meant simplicity, yet each layer uncovered seems embarrassingly complex. Structures aligned to solstices, carvings depict star constellations, trade networks span seas we thought untraveled. These revelations don't prove Hapgood's pole shifts or a lost superculture, but they do erode the neat borders between civilized and primitive. The deeper we dig, the older intelligence looks. Coastal peoples understood astronomy enough to track migration seasons and rainfall. They measured lunar cycles to predict tides. That might not sound advanced, until you realize modern navigation is just their intuition translated into mathematics. When Piri Reis credited maps older than the flood, maybe he was reaching back unknowingly toward the shared ancestry of all explorers. Humans whose worldview was drawn in stars and currents, not ink. Archaeology's new consensus paints pre-Ice Age humanity as bold, adaptive, and curious, traits that could birth cartography long before compasses. Early seafarers following bird routes might have etched coastlines on bone or shell. Over generations, those sketches could transform into formal charts. None survived the floods, but oral lore did. Polynesian ocean navigators still memorize currents as rhythmic chants, treating the ocean itself as map. Such living traditions prove you don't need writing to encode geographic genius. Multiply that memory system across tens of millennia, and you get something humanity rarely credits itself for: continuity. So when theorists claim that remnants of ancient charts resurfaced in Ottoman times, they're tapping into an uncomfortable possibility. That collective knowledge doesn't die, it just changes format. After all, Piri's compilation relied on inherited scraps. If a single maritime culture in the distant past kept records on perishable material, bark, skin, parchment, they wouldn't survive. But echoes of their coastlines could filter through later civilizations. Phoenician traders preserving distance tables, Hellenistic scholars transforming them into spherical geometry, Arab navigators embedding that math in route charts that eventually reached the Mediterranean. By the time Piri Reis gathered his sources, he may have been stitching together ghosts of maps whose creators were themselves barely remembered myths. In that sense, the lost civilization might not be an empire under ice but an idea, humanity's first network of shared observation collapsing under sea level rise. The proof isn't a single ruin, it's the consistency of knowledge. From cave paintings tracking lunar motion to the 1513 world map's equidistant projection, the curve of continuity never really breaks. It only submerges, resurfacing whenever curiosity outweighs fear. Recent discoveries make that curve even more convincing. Fossil footprints at White Sands in New Mexico, dated to 23,000 years, push human presence in the Americas back thousands of years earlier than once accepted. Stone tools in Brazil predate the supposed opening of migration routes. Genetic clock models reveal at least 3 independent waves of migration, implying maritime crossings sported long before modern historians allowed. In that light, the notion of early global navigation stops being fantasy and starts looking inevitable. Maybe that's why the Piri Reis Map still resonates. It suggests memory outlives catastrophe. Imagine ancient navigators watching the ice creep closer each generation, knowing their harbors would vanish. Maybe they passed their maps westward to survive the flood they couldn't stop. Centuries piled on centuries, translating parchment into legend, legend into rumor, and rumor into the data an Ottoman admiral would later weave into his masterpiece. It's romantic, yes, but not impossible, because every artifact we uncover from the late Ice Age suggests foresight. Fishhooks carved with symmetry, pigments ground for art, paths cut through glaciers for trade. These weren't people staring fearfully at nature, they were explorers. If they'd had time or fortune, perhaps their charts would have looked as unbelievable to us as Piri's did to the Air Force. Between glaciers and geopolitics, one truth endures: curiosity is a species instinct. Whether it's a prehistoric sailor sketching a coastline on driftwood or a 21st century satellite scanning subglacial lakes, the impulse is the same: to turn the unknown into pattern. The Piri Reis Map just happened to capture that repetition in ink, bridging countless forgotten cartographers through one act of conservation. So when we ask who truly drew the uniced coast that haunts the parchment, maybe the answer isn't singular at all. Maybe it's humanity itself, every anonymous voyager whose memory of the world survived long enough to be borrowed by another. If knowledge can outlive continents, then the boundaries between myth and memory aren't barriers, they're coordinates. And somewhere on that ancient, drowned horizon, the first mapmaker's shadow still points south, guiding us toward a truth resting under both time and ice. Theories that refuse to die. Every mystery that captivates humanity eventually becomes two stories, the one told by evidence and the one told by longing. The Piri Reis Map sits forever between them, enduring every scientific correction yet never losing its spell. After 5 centuries, it still provokes that same impossible question: what if we really did forget an entire chapter of human history? That single what if keeps the theories alive, mutating through generations like legends told around different campfires. The most famous and perhaps the most seductive is Atlantis. Plato's allegory of a vanished society advanced beyond its neighbors has fueled centuries of speculation. Hapgood's pole shift ideas gave the myth a modern address beneath Antarctic ice. If the planet's crust once slipped, the argument goes, then a flourishing island continent could have frozen almost overnight. The sudden flood that ended its greatness would become memory's template for every deluge myth that followed. For believers, the match is poetic perfection. A lost civilization entombed under the same ice that later appeared on Piri Reis's map. A parallel theory traces the map to ancient mariners, Phoenicians, Minoans, or Egyptians, who supposedly circumnavigated the globe millennia before Columbus. Advocates point to shared architectural motifs and star alignments across continents as evidence of forgotten contact. The Piri Reis Map, they claim, is one surviving copy of a global marine survey completed when sea levels were lower and intercontinental travel easier. In this reading, the Ottomans weren't drawing mystery. They were preserving history deliberately erased by time. Then there's the cosmic theory, the whisper that someone above had a better view. Brought to life by post-war fascination with UFOs, it imagines extraterrestrial cartographers handing knowledge to early humans. The precise curvature of coastlines, the mysterious projection method, the anachronistic accuracy all become artifacts of off-world observation. By the 1970s, talk shows and paperbacks were waving the map around as ancient astronaut proof. It required no messy geology, just imagination. That civilization's first teachers descended from the stars, handed us knowledge, and disappeared into the dark again. Each version tells us something about its believers. The Atlantean theorist yearns for continuity, proof that humanity was once wiser, capable of rebuilding if given another chance. The ancient sailor camp celebrates exploration. Their heroes are the forgotten scientists meticulous enough to chart the globe with reed boats and astrolabes. The alien advocates reveal a different ache, the hope that genius came from outside, that our achievements are echoes of visitors now gone. All three explain the unknown by enlarging humanity, either its past greatness or its cosmic significance. Critics dismiss them as wishful scaffolding built on mismatched data, but the persistence of these tales says more than any debunking could. They repeat because they satisfy a narrative hunger modern science rarely feeds, the desire for origins wrapped in grandeur. The facts shrink to bullet points, ice ages, projections, misread coordinates. The legend swells into saga, lost worlds, celestial mentors, secret archives. Its storytelling's oldest alchemy turn uncertainty into meaning. Still, fragments of truth glint within the sweep. Oral traditions from every continent speak of floods and lands swallowed by rising seas. Myths from Sumer to Polynesia remember ancestors escaping drowned coasts. Archaeologists translate those fables as metaphors for post-glacial sea level rise, but metaphors often preserve memories. The resonance between story and geology isn't coincidence, it's human record-keeping performed with metaphor instead of ink. Perhaps the Atlantean legend endures precisely because it condenses millions of lived catastrophes into one symbolic collapse. Psychologists see another layer, the allure of forbidden knowledge. When institutions declare something impossible, belief becomes rebellion. To insist that old maps hide secret truths is to steal a little authority back from textbooks. That's why the legend thrives online. Arguments about coordinates evolve into identity statements, skeptics versus seekers, science versus imagination. The debate outlived its evidence because it turned personal. Believers defend the possibility of wonder itself. Skeptics defend the reliability of reason. Both sides need the map as anchor for their worldview. Yet step aside from combat and a quieter interpretation emerges. Maybe myths of drowned continents aren't lies but cultural survival strategies. Passing down the memory of catastrophe as moralized story ensures it isn't forgotten. When ancient storytellers warned that hubris sunk great cities, they might have been relaying actual climatological trauma, the end of the Ice Age retold as divine punishment. Through that lens, the Piri Reis Map becomes less prophecy and more reminder. Catastrophes come, civilizations fall, memory fragments endure. That's why even debunked theories refuse burial. They operate like folklore ecosystems. Every new scientific discovery, subglacial lakes, buried mountains, possible microbes surviving under the ice acts as fertilizer. Even if unrelated, each revelation allows believers to say, see, the old stories weren't entirely wrong. Doubt ensures relevance, partial confirmation ensures immortality. In this feedback loop, truth and myth evolve together, feeding each other's persistence. From a cultural standpoint, the Piri Reis Map is a mirror reflecting our shifting relationship with mystery. In the 19th century, it symbolized human discovery, proof of historical curiosity. In the 20th, it became shorthand for Cold War anxiety and lost power. In the internet age, it stands for the democratization of knowledge. Anyone with Wi-Fi can challenge the academy. The map's endurance charts the psychological map of our own century, restless, skeptical, dream-hungry. Some scholars propose that our fascination endures because the map collapses distance between eras. It offers a tangible bridge from hand-drawn parchment to satellite imaging, from intuition to algorithm. The continuity reassures us that curiosity never froze. Even if the southern coastline is misdrawn, the ambition behind it, the need to see beyond, runs straight into our time. When people argue over its lines, they're really wrestling with what those lines represent. The possibility that human imagination outruns the instruments meant to measure it. And maybe that's the secret heartbeat behind every enduring theory. Atlantis, alien cartographers, prehistoric surveyors, each is a metaphor for curiosity refusing extinction. We project our own intellect backward or upward, creating ancestors or visitors grand enough to justify the wonder we feel. The scientists demand evidence, the dreamers demand awe. Neither can erase the other because both build from the same raw material, a need to believe the world still holds unopened rooms. So perhaps the biggest revelation isn't in the map's ink at all. It's in us, the species that keeps finding patterns in coastlines and constellations, determined that meaning lies just beyond proven fact. The Piri Reis Map survives not because it hides the truth, but because it represents truth's horizon, a place always receding as we advance. Myth or memory, projection or prophecy, it doesn't matter. What matters is the chase. Theories die only when curiosity does. And curiosity, unlike ice, never stays frozen for long. Meaning under the ice. Every mystery eventually circles back to the same place it began, the mirror. After centuries of searching for proof that an Ottoman admiral mapped Antarctica before its discovery, we finally end up staring at ourselves. Because beneath all the theories, pole shifts, and spectral civilizations lies something simpler and more persistent, the human craving to see meaning where the world hides blankness. Antarctica is the planet's purest canvas, white, silent, and indifferent. We project our fears and fantasies onto it because it's one of the last spaces that never talks back. Think about what that blankness represents. For 500 years, artists and politicians alike have tried to fill it with monsters, myths, or flags. The Piri Reis Map just happened to do it first. His strokes across that empty southern ocean transformed absence into possibility. In doing so, he didn't just sketch geography, he revealed a truth about how curiosity works. We can't stand the void. Confronted with silence, we draw lines. Confronted with mystery, we invent history. It's how we survive uncertainty, by converting it into pattern, even when the pattern turns out to be an illusion. Modern science has followed the same impulse, trading parchment for radar. Each new satellite tears back another layer of white, searching for terrain, for data, for something solid under the ice. And in those scans, we keep finding versions of ourselves, proof of ingenuity, of blindness, of persistence. The closer we look under Antarctica's crust, the more the expedition feels psychological. We're mapping depths in search of orientation, chasing confirmation that the world makes sense. Yet every discovery, hidden lake, buried mountain, chemical signal of ancient life, asks a subtler question: can knowledge itself ever be complete? Maybe that's what makes the Piri Reis Map endure. It's a reminder that even errors can point us toward wonder. The map's South Pole enigma spawned myths, but every myth drew new explorers south, each generation replacing fantasy with measurement. That constant replacement, belief becoming evidence, evidence birthing new belief, is the real engine of progress. The parchment might be mistaken, the coastlines exaggerated, the projection warped. Yet without its impossible precision, would anyone have looked so hard for the truth hidden below miles of ice? Doubt, not certainty, made us curious. There's another layer, though one we rarely admit. Antarctica exposes a cultural paradox. The continent exists outside ordinary law, belonging to no nation, yet every country longs to own it symbolically. Religious thinkers call it a moral wilderness, scientists a planetary archive, corporations a resource vault. Each label reveals the same desire to claim meaning over emptiness. In that way, the Piri Reis Map wasn't wrong, it was prophetic. It predicted not geography but obsession, the continuous human project of transforming the unknown into treasure. When we watch modern powers competing for influence there, we're witnessing an ancient reflex. Knowledge and conquest have always been twins. The Admiral's ink lines were both curiosity and control, early data collection in the service of empire. Now satellites orbit above, performing the same ritual with digital precision. History's circle closes neatly. Those who map the void rule the map. And between lines of latitude and cables of geopolitics, the ice becomes a metaphor for everything we still prefer not to face. Because truth, like ice, can gleam and conceal at once. Look from one angle and you see purity, from another, distortion. The legends of a pre-Ice Age civilization might be fiction, but their persistence shows how deeply we want redemption built into history, an assurance that intelligence, once achieved, never truly disappears. Even the skeptics cling to a softer version of that hope, that human knowledge is cumulative, that the things we lose resurface eventually, improved upon. The map becomes sacred not for what it proves, but for what it promises, that forgetting is never total. Every generation remakes the myth to suit its moment. Mid-century believers saw the Piri Reis Map as a clue to Atlantis. Modern viewers see it as a warning. What if the true message is that ancient humanity mastered the Earth, but that mastery always ends in ice? Civilizations rise, temperatures fall, memory freezes. The next wave begins by thawing what the last froze. To study that cycle is to admit our fragility, to deny it is to repeat it. The parchment on the palace table in 1929 looked like art, but maybe it was history's mirror whispering, remember what forgetting costs. Antarctica keeps that memory intact because it can't do otherwise. Beneath each layer of snow lies another, compacted and pristine, chronological as a diary you can't open without destroying. Scientists drill ice cores to read those pages. Each bubble of air is an ancient breath caught mid-exhale. When they melt samples in labs and measure carbon traces from long-dead forests, they're hearing echoes from eras when the continent was green. In that way, modern research fulfills the map's metaphor, unrolling the planet's oldest scroll and trying to decipher handwriting blurred by time. So here's where the story settles, not in revelation but reflection. Maybe the Piri Reis Map wasn't evidence of lost technology or gods from the sky. Maybe it was proof that the drive to connect dots across impossibility has always defined us. The same instinct that made early sailors follow birds across the horizon now sends orbiters gliding above the pole. The same act of faith, scaled up with better tools. Civilization might never have known Antarctica before 182, yet imagination had already reached it. The world didn't need discovery to exist, it needed belief. And that brings us to the present moment, suspended between awe and alarm. As ice retreats and nations advance, the hidden becomes visible again. We stand at a mirror edge watching our reflections blur into climate maps and treasure charts. The most forbidden knowledge left isn't about who drew Antarctica first, it's about whether we'll preserve what's left once it's free of ice. The past mapped a coast that shouldn't have been exposed. The future may repeat that error in real time. Maybe that's the lesson buried underneath the legend. Curiosity is holy, but conquest is repetition. The map teaches both. And if we're wise, we'll read it correctly this time. Because in the end, Antarctica is more than frozen land. It's judgment rendered by nature on every civilization that thought the world belonged to them. As the wind scrapes over glaciers older than language, the ice keeps its counsel. It remembers without speaking. And maybe that's the real truth they never meant for us to see, that beneath every discovery, beneath every charted line, still lies the same ancient silence reminding us what kind of world disappears when wonder turns to ownership. The secret's still buried. The funny thing about truth is that it never stays still. For half a millennium, the Piri Reis Map has sat between myth and measurement, daring each new century to interpret its silence. We've thrown science at it, skepticism, hope, conspiracy theories, radar satellites, and still it refuses to yield a final answer. Maybe that's the point. Some mysteries aren't solved, they're lived. They remind us that curiosity is older than proof and stronger. What keeps this map alive isn't the ink but the echo. It embodies a paradox that defines our species. Every time we think the story of the world is finished, we discover another chapter under the ice. The parchment found in a forgotten palace has survived empires, wars, and even truth revolutions. It outlasted the men who debated it, and it keeps provoking questions their formulas never quite settled. Who were we before we started recording ourselves? What knowledge did we lose when coastlines drowned, when libraries burned, when time erased the routes once cut by ships that never returned? The map doesn't answer, it just hands the questions back. That's why it endures in basements, message boards, and lecture halls alike. The Piri Reis Map isn't a relic of lost civilization so much as proof of lost humility. It forces the smartest among us to admit that history might still hold surprises too large for peer review. The same feeling that pulled an Ottoman admiral to trace forbidden shores still drives us now, the need to reconcile imagination with evidence, wonder with reason. In that struggle, the parchment feels alive. Yet the real revelation has always been psychological. For modern nations, Antarctica remains a land of projection, of dreams, of greed, of nostalgia. The more we look, the more we recognize the same fires that fueled Piri's curiosity burning inside our satellites and treaties. Knowledge still doubles as conquest, discovery still tempts possession. The myth of forbidden knowledge becomes reality the moment someone digs deeper than wisdom allows. Maybe the secret everyone suspects under the ice isn't physical at all. Maybe it's a memory, the quiet confession that humanity has always known how to destroy the things that fascinate it most. Our maps are just apologies written ahead of time, polite promises that this era will do better. The Piri Reis controversy whispers a warning about what happens when interpretation turns into ownership. If that southern continent ever truly rises from its frozen silence, will we study it, or strip it bare again? Still, wonder persists. The next radar sweep might glimpse shapes beneath the ice that realign everything we thought we knew. Scientists already speak of anomalies, hidden canyons, magnetic ridges, patterns that don't fit expected geology. Most dismiss them as noise, but noise is often where discovery hums first. The idea that fragments of a forgotten world wait down there feels both impossible and inevitable. Maybe the past never vanished, maybe it's patient. So the map remains, half myth, half mirror, entirely human. It reminds us that every age believes it's advanced until the next unrolls its parchment. In the end, maybe truth isn't hidden, maybe it's preserved, waiting for us to look without the greed that blinds. That's the secret still buried beneath the ice. Knowledge survives, but wisdom is optional. And the moment the last layer melts, we'll find out which one we truly uncovered.